So our new virtue is, you guessed it, love. Now, love is a difficult virtue to discuss, especially in English, because the word is so adaptable. We can use it for pizza, we can use it for puppies, we can use it for people, we can use it for classes. And because it can go into all of these things, the word kind of becomes dilutable. That the more we use that word, often the less it means in context. I know I've been to many talks about love where the person repeats love so often. They're like, remember to love God and to love your neighbor, because as Jesus loved us, so we must love others. For God is love. And so we must remember that love is the most important thing. And even though that all is true, it's also kind of a snooze fest. And so, love is an important virtue. It's the height of virtues, but it's also difficult to discuss because it can kind of be diluted the more you talk about it. Now, one place where it still maintains its spirit, its value, is often in romantic relationships and in families. And definitely the first time someone says, I love you, the word has almost a sacramental, almost a holy quality. And also it's difficult because when people talk about the word love, they usually mean like a strong affection. Like, I really like this thing. I really like pizza. I really like puppies. And when you think about a good habit, a moral virtue that can form our character, that it's difficult to practice really liking something. So for instance, I'm not really a dog person. And so how do I practice really liking something that I don't like? It's not really something that you can do, or that is a moral practice. And so when we think about love as a virtue, this will be the definition we'll be using. It's the practice of considering and working for the good of others, even at the cost of the self. And we can see this really clearly, especially through parenting. And I would argue, especially through motherhood. And we can see this because a mother, through pregnancy, definitely takes a lot at the cost of the self for the good of the other, for the good of her child. And that this is important because, at this point, she doesn't even know this child. And yet she is sacrificing of herself for the good of this kid. And that doesn't end after the pregnancy is over. This continues as parents consider and work for the good of their children, even when their kids aren't super likable. This is part of just what we expect of parents, is this great outpouring of love as a virtue. And this kind of shows that, yes, you can practice love for those that are close to you. You can practice love for those that you do have great affection for. But you can also consider and work for the good of others that you don't know, or that you don't like, or that are your enemies. And that this will sometimes cost the self. It's not merely doing nice things for people that you like when you feel like it. That is not the definition of love. And love is going to require a balance of engagement and freedom. What I mean by freedom is the ability to make choices. That as I work for the good of others, I should support their ability to act and to choose good things. And similarly, on the other side, engagement involves actually taking time with the other. That it involves attention, it involves care. And this is really important because it can give us a sight into when you're falling into an extreme. That the extreme on one end is tolerance. And tolerance is giving someone else maximal freedom, but not really engaging with them. It's like, okay, you can do whatever you want, and I support that. And the thing is that oftentimes that giving that kind of freedom will, when pushed, mean that there's no engagement. It's like, okay, you can do whatever you want, as long as you do it over there, or as long as I can't see it, or as long as it's not in my backyard, or as long as I don't have to deal with you. And this is a problem ultimately, and this is why tolerance is not in the virtue of love. It has part of it, has that freedom, but you really need to bring it into balance with engagement in order for it to be a positive practice of the virtue of love. Now, similarly, on the other side, you have obsession, where you are engaged, like you are focused on this other person. But that focus, that attention, that care, without also supporting the other person's freedom, is bad. It's controlling. And that one's probably a little bit easier to see, but you really need a balance. And the balance is not always the same. So if I'm a parent of a 1-year-old, I'm not going to support the same level of freedom that I would with my friend. I need to have a lot more engagement in a particular type of engagement, and with some freedom, but minimal freedom. Now, if a child grows up to be 17 years old, like that freedom changes, that engagement changes, but they both need to be present in some way. And so the reason why I include this example of houselessness is that oftentimes, people, like, they recognize, like, oh, this is a problem and we need to care. We need to love people who are experiencing this. And we need to be aware of whether what we're saying is truly loving, or whether it's more about tolerance. It's like, they should be able to set up camps wherever, or they should be able to do this. And then, like, oh, but like if it's close to your home, or if it's doing this, like we start to freak out. And that kind of shows that, like, there are weaknesses in the ways that we think that we're loving, and that often our love is tolerance. So, like, I love this person if they do exactly what I want them to do. Or I love this person as long as they're never around me, or as long as they do whatever they do somewhere else. These are kind of where we can see weaknesses in the virtue of love. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is vulnerability and boundaries. So vulnerability is sharing something that's really important to you with someone else. And this tends to be the tool for growth in a relationship, both friendships, family, and romantic relationships. And in order to effectively be vulnerable with people, we also need to support boundaries. And boundaries are also really helpful in understanding the limits, the boundaries between individual responsibility and group responsibility. And so there's a link that I'd like you to look at, which explains what boundaries are. It's really, really helpful. So please do that now. So you've looked at the difference, you've looked at what boundaries are and the difference between like a burden and the daily load. And I'll give some examples of how I've seen boundaries be helpful. One, when I was 9 years old, my mom married my stepdad, and he had a garden, and I'd never grown up with a garden. And my daily chore for the day was to go pick the weeds in the garden. And so I went out there, 9 years old, and started picking weeds, and I picked everything that looked like a weed, including a new plant in my world, the zucchini, which kind of looked like the pokey plants that grow in the grass sometimes. And so, like, it looked like a weed, it looked dangerous and scary to me, so I picked all the zucchini and killed them all. And my stepdad comes out and he's like, whoa, like, you picked all the good plants. I was like, but they look bad. He's like, yeah, they do, but they're good. And I was like, oh, I didn't know. And he's like, okay, well, you picked them and they're dead now, so you need to replace them. And I was very much like, no, I didn't know. And he's like, no, you need to replace them. Like, you did this, you didn't know, but it does have an effect. Like, these plants are dead. And so you got to go replace them. And so kind of, I hated every moment of it, but I did eventually, like, call a nursery. I bet they love, like, getting a call from a 9-year-old about some zucchini plants. And he said I couldn't buy seeds because it was too late in the growing season. So I needed to find plants that were already grown somewhat. And then eventually my mom drove me down there. I used my own money to buy the zucchini, and eventually we planted it. And the whole time, really up until the time I bought the zucchini, I hated every moment of it. But what my stepdad was doing here was he was recognizing these boundaries that that it could be tempting for him to like take this from me, this responsibility that I have, but it's better boundaries to give it to me. And I recognize that I did very little of this on my own. Like my parents drove me the places. Even my own money was given to me by my parents. So there was still like, a lot of support that was being given to me even as I bared my individual responsibility. And kind of similarly, and probably much more close to home, is when we look at homework and studying, that we should recognize our boundaries and our responsibility, and that, if someone asks you to just send their homework to them, this isn't only about integrity. This is also about like how to love your friend well, how to consider and work for the good for them well. That when we take other people's responsibilities, or when we push our responsibilities onto other people, this is not loving. It is good when we share what one person can't bear on their own, when we share our burdens. That is where love develops. But when we push our responsibilities onto other people, or other people push their responsibilities on us, it is the loving thing to say no to that. This is a way to build trust and effective boundaries in the relationship. Okay, we're going to move on to talking about one of the most difficult things. Like, how do you love your enemies? How do you love those who hate you? And I want to give you a little bit of time to read over the attached text, which is from the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus talks about how to love your enemy. And so he says, that we should do this. We should love our enemies because God loves all people. And that if you only love those who like you, this isn't really like all that great of a thing. That like, don't the tax collectors do the same? And what he's saying here is basically like, don't the worst people do the same thing? Like, and honestly, when you think about it, one of the biggest evils that we're wrestling with in our society right now is racism. And when you think about it, racism, its heart is often first in love of what is similar rather than hatred of the other. And it's only after like recognizing like, oh, I just love people who like me and I love people who are similar to me, then you encounter the other, and then it's easy to be like, whoa, and I don't know you, I'm confused, and in that confusion, that's where racism begins. That's where racism is supported. And so we need to love our enemies. We need to love those who are not similar to us. That this is where love is truly shown. That having merely strong affection for those that give you reinforcement is not love. And one note here is that when Jesus uses the word perfect, so he says, so be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect, the Greek word is teleos, which suggests more about being whole, mature, fulfilled, and achieving the goal, rather than without error or mistake. I think that the translation perfect is a little bit weak because it suggests almost like a purity culture, that we must be without any error or mistake. And that's actually not what Jesus tends to be talking about throughout the whole gospel. Jesus is calling for transformation of character, which is whole, mature, fulfilled, achieving the goal, rather than like this rule-based morality, which would be like you should have fulfilled all the requirements, you should be without mistake or error. And so I think that's important to recognize there. And so kind of within this, when we think about loving well and illustrating our boundaries and going deeper into vulnerability, that it's important that we have a good understanding of the difference between conflict and violence. Because one, loving well definitely supports that in order to love my enemies or those that I don't agree with or those that are different from me, I should embrace conflict, which is working through differences and difficulties with a vision of the future that includes the other person. That I should imagine a future where we're going to be okay together. And in that, we discuss and we solve and new possibilities arise. Now, violence is working through differences and difficulties with a vision that can't include the other person or can't include the other group. It's like, okay, we're going to work through this, but at the end, this group is not going, like, cannot exist, or this group cannot continue to be. And this is where violence comes in. And I think we're going to do a lot more with this, especially second semester. But this is important to recognize that that as we love, we should resist the second and go and actually support conflict, because loving well will often involve conflict. That when we like support other people's freedoms, but also take the trouble to get to know them, this is going to bring up conflicts, and that's okay. But we need to go through it in conflict, not in violence. Okay, so if you know your theology, you may know that love is one of the theological virtues. Faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love. And one of the important things is that you won't find much disagreement from people saying that faith is a supernatural virtue or theological virtue. And you'll also probably not get much pushback regarding hope as like a transcendent thing, a thing that's beyond the here and now. But there are so many examples of love without a necessary connection to spirituality, it seems strange to regard it as a theological virtue. I mean, after all, like the example I gave to start out with love is parenting. And parenting is a pretty universal experience, at least in the sense that everyone has parents. That if it's a solid example of love, then wouldn't the virtue be more natural? And the way it makes sense to me in seeing love as a supernatural virtue is when I think about faith and hope, which we'll talk about later, that they're similar to love in the sense that in every act of love, there's a necessary risk. If I share something vulnerable about my experience with the hope of connecting with someone, there's a chance that person I share with doesn't care about it. If I work towards reconciliation with someone, there's a chance that they double down on the harm they did, and I go away feeling worse than I did before. There's a chance that, if I'm a parent, I could care about my children. I could give them the appropriate levels of freedom. I could be really engaged with them, but they could grow up, move away, and resent me. I could tell this person that I like them, and they could reject me. And this kind of getting there, that behind every act of love, there's this question, like, what if they don't respond well? What if they don't do this? What if they don't do that? And that question is real. And in those deeper moments of love, like when you engage with people that you don't particularly like, or that are really different from you, or that don't like you, this question becomes even more glaring, or the more important it is to you, the more vulnerable you are when you choose it. And there's a lot going on within that unknown answer to that question. And this jump to action in love is not unlike the leap of faith, that we trust even though we don't know everything. We trust in that relationship even though we don't know what's going to come forward. And in that question and in this act, there is that glimpse of what God is like. There's that glimpse of what the cross means. And in this act of loving, even though we don't know what they're going to do, we can see a little bit of what God's attitude towards us is like. That we as Christians understand that God created us in freedom to choose to partner with God in developing the beauty of creation. And that within freedom, there is risk. That in some sense, as we love, we see kind of God's posture towards us is what if they don't respond? What if they don't care? What if they don't do any of these things? It's actually pretty beautiful when you consider it from that point of risk. Okay. So there is a section on your notes that you're going to go through, and it's talking about particular practices with regard to self-sacrifice. And I'm not going to go into detail with those on this video, partially because they're pretty self-explanatory. I will briefly say that the first two, that fasting and diligence, these are helpful practices, And the reason why I list these first is that they're helpful practices that you can do without other people, that you're building similar habits, but kind of like if you're a person who's like, I prefer to do a little bit of work on my own before I like go to the group, this is a way to practice love in that way. The rest of the practices are more what you'd expect, where it's like, okay, no, this is how you really work to consider and work for the good of others. And so, yeah, I hope you find a lot of value in those, but we're going to move more towards the last two groups, which are more about mindset and in particular, love of God. So an accompanying mindset that's really crucial to practice love well is humility. And humility isn't thinking less of yourself. It's not like not being able to take a compliment or anything like that. It's about like the habit of thinking more about others than you think about yourself. And yeah, it's not to think less of yourself, it's to think of yourself less, as C.S. Lewis writes. And so the best thing you can do, the best practice you can do for this is hidden service. That the opposite of humility is pride, like putting yourself forward, caring only about yourself, selfishness. And a lot of people, when they do good things, they might subconsciously be doing it for like the good feelings that they get, or like, oh, like other people saw me doing this good thing. Like, yeah, I am. I'm pretty awesome. And when we do hidden service, and this is doing something good for others and then not telling anyone about it, this is probably the best way to work on humility and on love, because like the more you try to do it, you might even be like, oh man, like I didn't tell anyone. I should tell someone that I did a really good job of not telling anyone. Like that, even as our subconscious pride might go against it, like that practicing this really does start to develop that sense of humility. And another example would be really praying blessing over others. This can be done out loud. That if you're not in the practice of praying for other people out loud when appropriate, it's a really powerful experience of loving and thinking of others more than the self. And oftentimes when we pray, we often will immediately go to our own concerns, and that's not necessarily the only way to do it. You can also pray blessing over people silently. One you can do is like just silently as you walk around throughout your day is like, may this person experience great joy and awareness of God's presence. That's something you can pray over anyone kind of at any time. And kind of in line with that, it's also good to really think about other people's strengths and the effort that they make, and specifically call that out in appreciation. This is another really solid practice of humility. And the third one is kind of fun and interesting, is that when we're combating pride, pride doesn't like to be not taken seriously. And so having a sense of humor about yourself is a good way to develop humility, that we end up not taking ourselves too seriously, and we don't put ourselves up on a pedestal the more we build a sense of humor about ourselves. And so I've got an example for this, and it's often to do with when you're at an event. And so the first example will be about clapping during Mass. And so there's often like all this controversy about clapping during Mass. And I'll just explain real quickly that the heart behind not clapping during Mass is that that there is no true audience for Mass, that we're all participating together. And that kind of like you don't give a presentation and be like, everybody, let's clap for whoever did that presentation. That was awesome. The goal there is to be like participants in relationship with God. And so we're there together as a participant, and it's also like in thanksgiving for what God has done. And so when we clap for like the musicians or for how great the homily was or whatever, that it's kind of taking us out of that. It's more about prudence than anything else. And I'll say that like going to a lot of Masses with students, that I'll be honest, the first impulse to clap is often out of humility, partially because like when you're clapping and nobody else is, like that's uncomfortable, and usually you're not thinking as much about yourself. And so if that's your inclination, like when you hear something great and you're like finished and you're just like, oh, I want to clap, like that's actually a good thing. Now, if you're at a student mass and the clapping is still going long after it's supposed to have ended, and like the people who are clapping at the end are clapping for themselves. And even as you look around, it's often like, hey, like look at me, like, oh, this is so funny, and it's not really all that funny. But yeah, you can kind of see that there, that like the initial impulse to clap is often in humility, and the people who are clapping last, like as a disruption, are doing it like out of pride, like in order to get people to look at them. And I often consider the same thing when I think about standing ovations, that at the end of a play or at the end of a speech, often the people who are standing up first, like that's uncomfortable. And then everybody else is kind of in that like, oh, is it like really a standing ovation? Like, is this what we're doing now? And these people tend to be thinking about themselves like, how can I be a part of the group? Whereas often the first people are like, yeah, this was awesome. Like I'm standing up. It's often more out of humility. And so this isn't meant to judge, or it's mainly meant to like give some insights. Like, am I acting out of humility or am I acting out of pride? Because the similar action can look different depending on what I'm going for. Okay, so last thing we're going to talk about is how love works as a virtue in light of love of God. So there are three ways that we mainly do this. One is through gratitude, the other is through prayer, and the other is through worship. So gratitude is giving thanks for the things and the actions that God has done. And it's important to recognize like how we go about this gratitude. With regard to things, we give and we express our love of God through giving thanks for the gift of creation, whether it be nature, whether it be food, whether it be drink, whether it be air, whether it be our friends. And one of the things within gratitude is that rather than asserting our personal merit, that like I earn these things, like that my ambition achieved these things, we recognize and we receive and we cherish unearned gifts like the air, like nature. We recognize that like definitely in our modern society, we don't build almost anything. Like almost everything we have is due to the work of others or of collaboration, that we should receive these things as gifts in gratitude. And in events, when we think about like our memories, we can practice memory of these mountaintop experiences where God was most visibly present. We often experience this through feelings of peace, through feelings of purpose and beauty. And when we look at difficult memories, we often will like experience gratitude for them, like kind of in the way of the cross, that we see God as participating and empathizing in those moments. And one important thing when we look at difficult moments, that some difficulties may be worthy of gratitude in the sense of like soreness. After working out, you're like, oh man, like I'm grateful for this feeling because like I know that I've done something valuable. I know that I've done something that's good for me. Whereas some suffering, such as oppression caused by people, you don't give thanks for the oppression. Kind of like in the sense of like if you hurt yourself working out, you don't be like, oh man, that's good. I better like work more on this knee. I better go really hard tomorrow. No, you don't give thanks for that. You give thanks for God's presence in the midst of it. That they're like, it's about, you give thanks for the presence, not for the circumstances. And this is important because sometimes people feel like they have to, we're supposed to be grateful in all things. So they like thank God for things that are actually evil. And that can lead to a kind of a warped spirituality. The second one is prayer. And prayer is kind of a Christian term for conversation with God. And so love obviously requires time and attention. And prayer is our primary way of doing that with God. And pre-written prayers are helpful, especially when in community or when you don't know what to say. But they shouldn't be the only thing that we use for prayer. Kind of similar, like if you're studying a foreign language, it can be good to practice some dialogues. But if you're a fluent speaker, you need to be able to go off script. And so that's important. And kind of continuing with that language metaphor, not all prayer is speaking. It involves listening as well. that being limited beings, it's important to recognize that when we're listening, we're not listening for like the audible voice of God. Most often the language of God is in peace. And so we're listening and recognizing that God will work through like our being as it is. And kind of a last point, and this is really crucial, that prayer is not merely asking for things. Sometimes people will be like, well, God doesn't answer my prayers. It's like, well, is that the only prayer that we're saying? Because if a prayer relationship involves only asking for things, it's not difficult to see that that's a weak relationship. If you've got a friend that only talks to you when they ask you for something, like, that's not really a deep friendship, maybe not even a friendship at all. And so honestly, like the more you go deep into prayer as a full relationship, you see that like God not answering a prayer, like when you ask for something, becomes of a less big deal, even if you ask for something really important. Just like if I have a deep relationship with a person and they can't help me on this thing, I don't like lose all faith in that relationship, because my relationship with someone isn't built off of like what do they give me, and when I ask for help, do they give help? That's not the only thing that I'm working towards. And in the last one, there's also a lot of confusion. This is worship, which is appreciation of who God is. And like prayer, worship is often minimized to the point where, and I've heard many people reject Christianity on this basis, that they're like, doesn't God seem like a woefully insecure person who's like, I need constant approval and attention, and so I'm going to create these beings to like constantly look at me and be like, you are so awesome. And this is weird because people should reject that. That's a strange thing to want to imitate or to be in relationship with. And so it's important that we have a robust understanding of what worship is. And worship isn't merely praising God and saying how good God is out of obligation. Like imagine being in a romantic relationship where your boyfriend or your girlfriend is always demanding a certain amount of compliments. This would be a warning sign. But similarly, on the other side, imagine a romantic relationship where your boyfriend or girlfriend doesn't seem to appreciate you at all. This would also be a warning sign that when we think about worship as appreciation, it's much more real and much more nuanced and valuable than obligatory praise. It's word and actions like recognizing the goodness of the other person and the appreciation of the relationship. And I tend to view traditional worship in this way. So like when I go to Mass, I see it kind of similar to going on a date or going to a family dinner. I don't go on a date with my fiance because I have to. I do it because I love her. And I don't go to have dinner with my family because I have to, but because I care about my family. I appreciate them. And like most of the time, obligation is going to be the furthest thing from your mind. In fact, in these kinds of relationships, obligation tends to only creep in when things are bad. And so this is important when we think about worship, that if we're seeing worship as purely obligatory, that's not a sign of closeness. And so when we think about even like worship music, this is important too. It should be less of terms of like obligation, that we need to like worship God to sate his God's insecure demeanor. No, it should be about a beautiful artistic expression of a relationship. Kind of like if you were to practice a song on guitar in order to play for someone you love, you don't do that because like they demanded a certain amount of songs be played for them. No, that'd be weird. But you do it because you care about this person. You care and you want to appreciate who they are. You want to notice the good. It kind of circles back to gratitude. And so I hope that was helpful in understanding these three. And I spent a lot of time with these partially because, especially the last two, can be really confusing and can lead to a really warped understanding of spirituality. Thank you for watching. I'll see you later.